Hello everybody, my name is Jamyang Oliphant. I came into contact with Himalayan and the Tibetan world at a very young age. My family, they were students of the scholar and Dzogchen master Chogyal Namkha Norbu. So since a young age I was exposed to many Tibetan masters and Tibetan culture and scholars, and gradually as I grew up I was very interested in Tibetan Himalayan world. I traveled to Nepal and India quite young, and then I studied Tibetan and religions, first at the University of SOAS in London, the School of Oriental and African Studies, and later I went on to Oxford University, where I did a PhD about Tibetan medical history, historical literature of Tibetan medicine. So around that time, I started collaborating with Shang Shung Institute UK. Initially, I helped with fundraising for the activities in London. We regularly do courses, seminars, such as today's, which I will talk about later. And so since maybe 2011, I started helping with Shang Shung UK, sometimes organizing weekend conferences here in London at our center in Hackney, London, other times remotely. We also organized trips around the Himalayan region, such as Ladakh, Eastern Tibet, Nepal. We have another trip coming up in Nepal. This is the first trip since COVID that we will organize again. So our idea is to make Himalayan culture and history and everything that we find valuable about it accessible to people, also to invite qualified scholars and researchers who really dedicated their life to Tibetan and Himalayan studies to come and share their findings. We find it's very important. So every month we're having guest lecturers come many times on Zoom because they're all over the world. And we have a YouTube channel, so you're welcome to visit it. There's a huge amount of topics, very wide-spanning topics from medicine to history to dharma to language, really many things. So for example, just today we did a literary day for the Dragon Year. We had a competition, a poetry competition with the theme of the dragon, since we just started the Dragon Year a couple of weeks ago. And the Yishe Literary Magazine also joined, and they will be publishing the poems. And we invited 3 guest speakers to talk about their areas of research and Tibetan literature. So we find Tibetan and Himalayan culture very valuable, and our idea is to preserve and divulge it in a real serious way with people who are really qualified. We're not interested in new age mishmash. We really want to go to the authentic roots of what we consider very precious heritage. So we're very happy also today that London is here making contact with you, and we hope also in the future we can work on different projects together, who knows. So thank you very much.
Well, my name is Julia Lawless, and I was director of Shang Shung here for 10 years, and now I've handed over to Jamyang, so it's in very capable hands. Now I mainly act as a meditation teacher for this centre. So I'm quite happy in a way that I'm not involved in the organisational aspect of the centre anymore, because it's a hell of a lot of work, actually. And this was before it was before the pandemic, and then including the pandemic as well. But the story of this place, it goes back a long way. And I can't really remember the origins of it, of Shang Shung. I was involved in the original body when it was called the International Shang Shung Institute. And then Rinpoche decided that Shang Shung would have different centres around the world. And in Europe, he specified that he wanted London as the cultural centre for Shang Shung in Europe. And we asked him, why is that? And he said it's because London is a very important cultural centre with the British Museum, the British Library, Wellcome Institute. There's a big Tibetan community here. So he specified he wanted to have this place. And in the beginning, there was the first director in the UK was someone called Dominic, and he was a professor at SOAS University. And he unfortunately passed away. Then a very good friend of mine, Judy Allen, she took over as director. And then after, I think, a couple of years of her being director, I took over that position. Originally, because we had a very close relationship with SOAS, University in London, that's before we had this centre here, Lek Dan Ling, we held many of our talks and our lectures in SOAS, and we had a very nice collaborative relationship with them, whereby we could go and use their lecture theatres, and they basically sponsored us. So things went on like that for many years. And Rinpoche and also his son Yeshe gave talks at SOAS. We did some quite important presentations there. So that's how Shang Shung in London got off the ground. Then, just over 9 years ago, Rinpoche also said we need to have our own place in London. And he was shifting his ideas a little bit of centres at that time, because initially, in the early days of the Dzogchen community, in the very early days of the Dzogchen community, he said, we don't need any centres at all, because that's going to be a problem to look after them. But then he was keen on having centres in the countryside, because it would be a good place for retreat. And we have a place in the countryside in Wales, which is a good place for retreat. Then he said we need places in the city. This is later on, because that's where most of the people are, and that you can make contact with people who are just living their day-to-day lives and working. So anyway, around 10 years ago, at his directive, we started fundraising for finding our own place. And it's not easy, because basically property in London is very expensive. But one way or another, I'm not quite sure how, we managed to raise the funds to get the deposit on this place here. And Rinpoche came and visited it in the very early stages, just when we had bought it. And at that time, this place looked like an underground car park. I have to say, it was not very impressive. It was a concrete cave. It was a concrete cave with some pillars. But he came here with a few of us, and he sat here and he said, oh, this is very good, but can you see the sky? And we said, yeah, if we open up the 2 skylights, one in here and one in here, then you can see the sky. And he said, okay, that's good, yeah, then we need to do that. So then we had his blessing, and he wrote this very nice, a kind of blessing for this place, and he also gave it a name, Lek Dan Ling, and we did a sort of authentication, very, very simple Dzogchen style here, and then we employed an architect to design the place. And we worked very closely with him because one of the main problems we had with this centre is one of his main Dharma teachings is the Vajra dance. And this means dancing on a mandala. And we then basically had the idea of this sliding door here. It's a sliding wall, in effect. And the sliding wall, the reason, or one of the reasons it's there, is because when you slide this wall fully back, the mandala will just fit into this space. And that's very difficult in London because most places have pillars. So if you slide this wall to one side, the mandala fits here, and then you could dance. And there is a bit of a story about this because I originally saw this place for sale. And I was in America at the time. And I looked on the map at the design of this place, and I had the measurements of the mandala. And it looked to me like it would just fit between the pillars. So some friends of mine came here, and they brought a builder, and they measured it, and they emailed me. They said, sorry, no, it's not going to fit. And I said, you're wrong. I was in America. And they said, oh, okay, then we come back again. And they came back, and they measured again, and it was true. You could just fit the mandala into this space. So it was a long story for finding this place and designing it and making it workable. And then we had many events here. We've had many festivals. And if you go onto the Shang Shung website and you look at our archive, we've had dance festivals and also literary festivals, all sorts of things. And yeah, it's been really nice. And also the connection with the Tibetan community here has been really beautiful. So I'm really, honoured, to have that connection and have made that connection over the time I was director. But it was a lot of work, and now I'm really happy that Jamyang, he's younger than me, he can do that now. So I hope that's useful, and that's what I'd like to say. Thank you.
My name is Fabian Sanders, and I'm from Italy, and I am the, let's say, director of the language department of the Hatha Yoga Foundation, which is a kind of umbrella organization for the all the things to which Chogyam Namkha Norbu Rinpoche gave birth, so to say. So my task it is to teach Tibetan classical language or Dharma language, and to teach translation from that language to different languages. I have students from all over the world and from various linguistic backgrounds, like from of course English, Italian, German, but also Russian, Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So different perspective on translation and on Tibetan language. So today here I try to introduce a little bit briefly or give some ideas, let's say, from a not too much scholarly perspective on the various ways one can use to classify Tibetan literature and the various genres that one might identify, with some also advice to sort of not to stick too much to these categories and be a little bit flexible, let's say. And today what we are having here was a day started with some introductions to several kinds of texts, such as, for example, the project of translating the Kanjur and Tenjur into English, and also on Karma Pakshi autobiography, or the biography of Karma Pakshi, and several of his songs, and the second Karmapa, let's say some of his composition, literary composition. In the afternoon, we had the, let's say, the final day of one, let's say, poetry competition. I don't think there is the possibility to compete in terms of poetry, no? But in any case, several authors presented their poems, and there was a selection of some which won and some which were runners-up and so forth, from Tibetan authors in Tibetan, but translated into English. And finally, we had a presentation by two poets in English language. The original is in English, like Julia Lawless and John Shane.
Fantastic. Can you all hear me? This is on mute, but then I'll echo. So. Do we have any questions, first of all, from our audience here? Julia?
I have a question, actually. It's a kind of awkward question. And that is that Fabian said how very tidy and convenient it was, that these Tibetan kings made it standardized, the translation, so you've got continuity, basically right up until now, until it started getting more colloquial. How does it work now with, for example, doing this massive translation project with all of these different translators? And it's incredibly difficult. All of these terms you can't even translate. And so how does it work? Any kind of standardization? Or, this must be a question that you're dealing with, for example, in the project you're doing, George, there's all these different translators. You come across a word, even like super or chotan. How are you going, you can't have the different translators translating it in different ways. So who's deciding? I guess that's my question. Where is the Tibetan emperor now,
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, it's an interesting question. This is actually what's really good about online publishing, because the 84,000 has a policy of not necessarily standardizing. There's always a tendency to standardize because people look at each other's translations, and then, there's a sort of natural tendency to then coalesce on the best, what people feel is the best translation. But there's no policy to standardize. So if you look on the 84,000 website, so you'll find the same term may be translated differently in different texts, but you can search for that term, so it's not lost. Do you see what I mean? Because of the online publishing, you can look up a Tibetan term and then you can find the different ways it's been translated. So, and that's why we've got all these glossaries and so on as well. So it's to sort of mark, I'm translating this, in this translation, this term is being translated in this way. So what we do is we try to have internal consistency. So within any given text, terms will be translated the same, within reason. Sometimes you have an alternative translation. So for example, in the 6 perfections, so Supa, Shanti, Shanti, it can be translated as patience, it can be translated as forbearance, it can be translated as acceptance. So what do you do? And so different translators have taken different options, but within the text we try to have it consistent. But then even within a same text, you might, because of the context of a discourse, sometimes acceptance might just be better, and in another context, patience might be better, or something. And then there's a way of tagging them as being the same term. So both of them, when you're reading them online, they'll go blue, you see acceptance, and you click it, and it'll say Shanti Sopa. And then you come across acceptance, and you click it, and it says Shanti Sopa, it's the same term. So it's all kind of transparent like that. So and I actually think it's an advantage that we haven't tried to standardize. Because like what, who was it Fabian saying about this, when you read a Tibetan text or a Buddhist text, often the last thing you translate is the title. Because only when you've read the whole text, you know really what the whole text is about. And that's also true in our text. What point was I going to make about that? I can't remember. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But yeah. Sometimes you need to read the whole text before you find the right translation choice for a term. And also the Tibetan standardization, like I said, it wasn't like from the beginning. So texts were being translated so this happened at the height of the patronage of translation activity, which is the early 9th century. Then they created the Mahavyupati, and they said all translations should conform to these terminological conventions. And then a certain number of texts were re-edited with that in mind, and they changed the terminology in Tibetan to conform with that. But that's by no means the whole collection. So it's not even fully standardized in Tibetan. And then translation activity stopped in Tibet. So by the 13th century, it's pretty much stopped.
That's interesting. So you're saying in some ways that having that flexibility through technology now is an advantage as opposed to this very tidy standardization.
Yeah.
It can work both ways then, this. On one hand it's kind of tidy, but on the other hand, it's like...
Yeah, I mean, Dharma is a really good example. You mentioned Dharma.
Yeah.
Certain texts it's used as like someone asks the Buddha what dharmas are required for a bodhisattva to gain awakening. It's a very standard kind of question that will happen. And in certain numbers of our texts, we translated this as qualities. What qualities does a bodhisattva need to achieve awakening? And then you have to, then it's about these glossaries to see. Every time you go over the word quality, it's like, you see that's the word dharma. But we haven't done what the Tibetans did, which is translate always. Every occurrence of dharma is translated as chö, which is pretty much, I think, true of Tibetan translations. Although sometimes you get dharma transcribed, don't you? But and maybe they were. I'm not sure actually how kind of completely rigorous they were about translating dharma every time as chö. But anyway, we haven't done that because we haven't found a word like in English. I don't know. Some translations just use dharma.
Yeah. But I guess in that sense, the idea is not really to have a term that reproduces the original in some way, but simply to say that is that. You can call it table for just that, and because it's a placeholder sort of, and you're not looking for something that is semantically similar or that represents even some of the meanings of the original. You're not looking for some word that has a biography in your language, because that is also a problem in translation. When you use words, you necessarily take them from a context that is different, and words do have personal histories, let's say. So they carry that over to the text you produce. And for example, I don't know, in translation of Buddhist text, you very often find all possible imaginable instances of nature. I don't know if you notice that. Nature is a word that, if you look, for example, dictionaries like the online dictionary, just to be, and you look English to Tibetan and you search nature or natural, you have like 200 Tibetan words that also mention nature. So that is, all of that makes things very, very problematic. But obviously with this technology, of course, it would be good to have all translations, that are done from Tibetan into Western languages, equipped with that technology that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that the flexibility is actually an asset in a way. Yeah. Otherwise, I do find working with later literature, sometimes I've had in discussions people say, "Oh, but you translated this as this, this particular term as this, and now you're doing it as that." Well, it's context, isn't it? If it suits, and also that sometimes there's a contemporary aspect that. I had a bit of an argument with my editor about the term mute. He refers to a mute, somebody who doesn't speak, and they say, oh no, you can't, it's a disability and we have to put it in a different way. Well, it's a bit, but I went, you have to go along with it perhaps, but just a minor example of those kinds of sensibilities that, you certainly wouldn't use, well, with an American sensibility anyway, the word dumb, because it has a different meaning nowadays than what it originally meant. So there's both the context of the text and also the context of modern times as well, which you have to take into account. Well, I think you have to take into account. Whereas if you just go, some kind of rigidity, it does make, for the readers maybe, it makes a bit of a problem because you don't really know what they're referring to. Sometimes somebody will use an extra term that you're not sure about. What does that really mean? But in the case of, the technology makes it available that, oh, it's that term, which I don't know that language, but at least I know it's that term, which is the same as that term. Yeah.
Can I ask
Thanks.
a couple of questions to George? George, you may have mentioned it, and I may have missed it, but I'm just curious, 84,000, where does that name come from?
Yeah, I was curious about that when I joined, actually. I wasn't sure, and basically it's a number that comes up all the time in the sutras. So it's not one thing. The one that people most often know is that the Buddha taught the Dharma in 84,000 ways, or 84,000 ways of expressing the Dharma. But it also comes up 84,000, gods, and also multiples of 84,000. So you get, and then in English it becomes, you lose the 84, so it becomes you get like 8,400,000. You get all different multiples of 10. It's and I'm not sure. To be honest, I don't know the answer to that. What is the specialness of that number? But it's everywhere. You find it in so many different contexts as just a large number. But that's the main one, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
One explanation I heard was that the 84,000 dharmas that the Buddha gave was to counteract the 84,000 emotions.
Oh.
Yeah. It's quite neat.
I'm
not sure it's true, but
no, it can be. It definitely could be. I heard that in terms of just the number, it is 8 and 4, which together makes 12, which is the month of the year, and it represents and symbolizes completeness. That is just a reading among others. Well, for example, if you go into the lives of Siddhas, I don't know if you had that opportunity, they always do things for 12 years. Whatever they do, it's 12 years. And it represents a complete, time cycle, so to say.
And George, you also mentioned that the Tibetan king gave an order that the Tibetan written language should be created in order to translate the Buddhist Sanskrit text. Now, I don't know very much about how written languages have evolved. I understood that some of the initial beginnings with some languages was simply making marks so as merchants could keep tags on, and then those marks developed. But are there any other precedents for a language being ordered to be created?
Yeah. Well, maybe certainly the language wasn't created. Do you know what I mean? Certainly the language pre-existed.
The
text, yeah. It's very much just a writing system.
Are there any precedents for that? Written?
Of just importing.
Ordering the creation.
There must be.
6th century in England, maybe. 6th century in England. The King of Kent, was it? And again, in a religious context, because religious people had the writing. I'm not sure how far back English writing goes, but he may well have used it. I can't remember the ecclesiastic who he used to, and that's what started the interest in Christianity. He was somebody who could write. But you have to look at it more carefully. I'm just, it's worse than Wikipedia. So.
But in the case of Tibetan, they created a whole kind of grammatical system. And that is kind of hugely interesting legacy, really, because they based it on some ideas of Sanskrit grammar, which doesn't really fit Tibetan as a language. So that's led to a kind of civilizational difficulty in some ways, because the way that the grammar of Tibetan is described often doesn't fit the way it sort of naturally is as a language. Something really interesting I found about this that I'd never read of before was actually in the Karchak of the Dege Kanjo by Situ Panchen, this 18th century scholar at Pelpung. And he said, I didn't heard this, maybe you've heard this, but that Tomi Sambuddha, who's said to be the minister of Songtsen Gampo, the king, who was sent to India to devise a script for writing Tibetan so that they could translate Buddhist scriptures, that he actually wrote 8 treatises on the language and how it works, and only 2 of them survive. You know the story? I hadn't heard this story. So only 2 of them survive. So there's only the Suntakpa, and the what's it called? The
Tajuk, I think.
Tajuk. Yeah. So and they're basically not really about grammar at all. They're about spelling rules, about what letters follow other letters and how they change if it's followed by that letter. And so they're not really about grammar at all. So there's no foundational grammar text about how Tibetan grammar works, which has led to quite a lot of debate over the centuries. As a result. But yeah, I thought it was an interesting tidbit that he wrote these eight books. And so it's described as a tree that's got no branches. Tibetan grammar is like a tree that's got no leaves or branches, just a trunk.
Like a telephone. But it's also grammar is, I think, generally understood to be descriptive rather than prescriptive or normative. So it should refer to something that actually existed now. According to Namkhai Norbu, for example, it is not true that there were no writing systems in the Tibetan area before. There was the Shang Shung script and other forms of maybe different styles of scripts and so forth, of writing down things. But some people say also that writing is something that you do when you cannot keep things in mind anymore.
We have a question from the online chat. Thank you very much for all the speakers, interesting overviews. Could you briefly comment on how the early Tibetan translators accessed and learned Sanskrit grammar so as to enable their translation work? If any of you have any particular comments or observations.
I'm not a Sanskritist, so that's my weakness as an employee at 84,000. I can read Devanagari script and know a bit of Hindi, but I'm not a Sanskritist. I've never studied Sanskrit. But we have editors and translators for whom Sanskrit is their first language and Tibetan only second. But no, I don't know. The colophons of all the texts, the Kanjo texts, the ones translated in the early 9th century, you get a sense over time, you reading more and more of them, the prominent translators. Yeshe De is the one that is like really, he's known as Shuchen Yeshe De, he's the great editor. And he I think it's a huge number of texts that he's mentioned in the colophon of. But I don't know any information about his knowledge of Sanskrit, or because nearly always what you have is you have Indian Pandita named. So Jinamitra, Dhanashila, Prajnavarman, lots of the prominent Panditas, and then a Tibetan translator. It's nearly always a team. So one assumes that Yeshe De, and I'm sure he did know Sanskrit, but it's not entirely clear, how they mediated the translation process. But they're very accurate and consistent and meaningful. They do, by and large, make narrative and logical sense the texts, which is an amazing achievement. And it was a relatively young literary language, but not a young language. That's another thing I've always been amazed by, is Tibetan language had such richness and depth of vocabulary. To translate all these Buddhist terms and philosophical kind of nuances into Tibetan, not borrowing terms. There's hardly any borrowing of words from Sanskrit into Tibetan. They use Tibetan words, and Dharma and Chö is an example, completely different word. There's very little borrowing. they had words for everything in some shape or form. Maybe some of those words were neologisms, maybe they were coined for the sake of translating Buddhism, but you get the sense that it was a very rich language that was able to express all these quite complicated ideas at that stage, before it was, a literary language. So, that I think supports the idea that, some people like Nankai Nobu has written about that there was a writing system before. I don't know about that. I think that's maybe controversial, but but it's likely, in a sense it's likely. It's also likely that Buddhism must have permeated, well, not just Buddhism, but all of the whole kind of religious culture of the wider Himalayas must have penetrated the plateau before, when we have the sort of formal adoption of Buddhism, according to Tibetan history. It must have been a more the connections between Tibetan religion and the religion of the Himalayas and India is not as simple as the narrative of just the king became devoted to Buddhism and decided to translate. It's more complicated.
Yeah, there was a project by the University of Virginia just looking at the initial part of the text and the colophons at the end. And so there is, I'm not sure that it got published eventually, but there must be some record somewhere that and you often see, I worked a little bit on some of it, but you get an Indian name and then the Tibetan, and they worked together on this. And then you maybe get an editor and even a further editor as well later, when perhaps it was re-edited. So you do get these names coming through. Occasionally, on some texts, you get a Chinese name as well, when it's taken from China, but they're very few.
Following up on that, we have another question for Goerge regarding Sanskrit and Tibetan words. So the question is, I wonder why you needed to translate the word stupa, especially as shrine. Seems so inappropriate. Reliquary would have been preferable. Nowadays, hardly anyone is unfamiliar with the word stupa, as it's become virtually generic. Especially people likely to be reading your translation will surely be familiar with it. Thank you. Please justify yourself.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. Yeah, it does seem unnecessary to translate because, for those reasons.
It's in the English dictionary.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is it?
So you don't need to translate it.
So, that's I'll bring that back to the boardroom. Mention it because maybe that's. I kind of agree. There is the slight thing of the title in Sanskrit is Chaitya Pradakshina. It's not Stupa Pradakshina. I don't know. I haven't looked at the Sanskrit manuscript. If the word is Chaitya throughout in Sanskrit, it does seem a bit odd to translate with another Sanskrit term that wasn't used in the original. So you've gone from Sanskrit to Tibetan to English, back to a different Sanskrit term that you'd started with. That would be a bit of a strange sequence of events. And if you said, circumambulating Chaityas, no one would understand what you're talking about. So, but it's possible that the text actually does use the word stupa throughout. And if it does, then I think there's a strong case for just translating it as stupa. And that text has not been published yet. So it's still going through some process.
Yeah, it's surprising how many, and you do notice it changing over the years as well, like Karma, Dharma, Buddha become now standard English, well, acceptable to print in a book, in a dictionary. I think even Sambhogakaya has even made it. Yeah, I'm not sure, but don't quote me on that. But
Mandala?
Mandala, yes.
Unfortunately, without the diacritics.
Pardon?
Without the diacritics.
Yes, Nirvana, Samsara. I don't think Nirmanakaya has, I'm not sure. But I'm not sure of Dharmakaya. I mean, people can just look them up. Yeah. But, it is
Tulku probably has.
Pardon?
Tulku probably has.
Maybe.
Bardo's probably in it as well.
Yes, Bardo, yes. Yeah, it's surprising. And then you don't need to try. Well, the premise with publishers is you don't need to translate it if it's already acceptable in the English dictionary.
We'll see what the future has in store. So I'll just come here so people on Zoom. Fine, I'm on stage, it's fine. So thank you so much to our three speakers of this morning. And this is a small gift for each of you. It's a book, since we're working with Tibetan Himalayan language and culture today. We thought this would be appropriate. This is a book by Tashi Manox, who came in the past. He's considered one of the best Tibetan calligraphers out there these days. And yeah, we will start again at 3 o'clock UK time, which is in about 1 hour exactly. We have the presentation of the Yish Literary Journal, and then reading the poems from the competition, which we just had, the Losar competition of the Dragon Year. And then we continue with open mic, poetry, momo, wine, and whatnot. So hope to see you all in 1 hour, whether in person or in Zoom. And thank you again, all three of you, for this.